Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've got a panel of guests here that are here to talk with us about the mental health concerns in the midst of a pandemic. We will have the guests introduce themselves in just a moment. I also want to express greetings to everyone joining in and tuning in with us today. CTS was delighted to host such an important conversation during these challenging times. We want to convene folks that can help share their wisdom and expertise and really pull together around this very important topic. And so thank you for joining us. And I'm going to invite our guests to share who they are, a little bit about their context and what they're seeing as it relates to mental health needs and concerns in that context. Nicole?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Robertson. I am a licensed clinical mental health therapist and an assistant professor at CTS in the clinical mental health counseling program. I particularly, and my colleagues in that program, we work to train our students to be able to become competent clinicians and handle their clients' needs holistically. So addressing their spiritual, emotional, psychological, and social needs. And so I'm here today and excited about being included in this conversation.
Glad to have you. Thank you so much. Suzanne? Suzanne, I think that you're muted.
Okay.
There
All right.
we go. Yeah.
I'm Suzanne Coyle, and I'm teaching pastoral theology and marriage and family therapy here at CTS. I direct the marriage and family therapy program that has been accredited by COAMTE, a national accrediting body, for over 25 years. And so I teach both in the MDiv side and the MFT side. So I, particularly on the MFT side, we try to focus on couples and families and some of their particular clinical issues. And on the MDiv side, I really try to focus upon how pastoral care can be learned and shown across the congregation.
Thank you so much for being here. Dennis?
Good afternoon, and thanks, Christina, for bringing us together, and good afternoon to all of you. I am Dennis Sasso. I am Senior Rabbi of Congregation Beth-El Tzedek in Indianapolis. I'm an affiliate professor of Jewish Studies at Christian Theological Seminary, and I think I am the only one among this distinguished group who is not a therapist nor a professional counselor. I am a pastor, a teacher, a preacher, a community activist and connector, and have had to relearn my profession over the past 3 months, how to deliver what used to be practiced in a very different mode before the COVID pandemic hit us. And so I am working hard at turning the virtual religious experience into a virtuous religious experience. So people continue to have me, and as a congregation of 750 households, we have been very engaged in trying to address the ordinary and the extraordinary realities that we face.
Thank you so much. David?
Christina, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks to CTS for this important conversation. I offer a virtual hello to all the panelists and all those who are joining us online. And I'm very appreciative that I could be a part of this conversation today. My name is David Chaddock, and I am the director of Centerpoint Counseling, which is the counseling ministry at Second Presbyterian Church, which we started a little over 30 years ago. And the goal of Centerpoint is to care for the emotional, relational, and spiritual needs of the Central Indiana community. So we serve as an outreach to the community, and we have grown over the years, and I'm appreciative of this conversation and the work that we are doing. There's been an interesting transition that I've seen as we've been moving through our current quarantine time. There certainly has been an immediate initial level of uncertainty and fear and some anxiety about what the future was going to bring. Then I noticed a kind of settling in, and people were somewhat more comfortable in their home space and feeling as though home was a safe space for them. Now I'm sensing a little bit of corona fatigue, if you will, and a little bit of restlessness. So I think it's an important time for us to be having this conversation. And again, I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for being with us, David. Mohammed?
Hello, good morning. Again, like everyone has said, thank you for hosting and having this conversation. I think it's much needed. Again, my name is Mohammed Sahir. I am a therapist in the Bloomington area. I also work at Indiana University at the counseling center there. So a lot of my clientele involves students, a lot of late adolescents and early adults or early adulthood. So as I mentioned, I'm just so glad we're having this conversation because there's so many pieces in between that large span of people I'm talking about here that I think this could be very much appreciated by them as well as ourselves. I'm also doing some private practice in the Bloomington area as well. Some things I'm noticing as we're kind of going through the COVID shuffle, it seems like right now, is it's kind of a stressor that's on top of our other stresses. So I think it's natural for us to have stressors. I think it's okay for us to wake up at times and say, I don't want to do X, Y, or Z. But right now we're dealing with that on top of a layer of we don't know what's going on exactly. So that's kind of what I'm noticing amongst clientele.
Yes, thank you so much. And as you all have introduced yourselves for this conversation, I want to invite also our viewers, if you're tuning in, whether it be on Facebook or Twitter, go ahead and tell us who you are and where it is that you are tuning in from. We would love to kind of know who's in the audience. And so to kind of echo a lot of what has already been said, there was a recent survey that said that 45% of US adults were in fact being impacted by the stress and uncertainty that's layered on in this time of pandemic, that their mental health has been negatively impacted. And there was another article that was published that spoke to this potential for the next pandemic to be one of a mental health nature, meaning that perhaps mental health would be so disruptive that would be the next thing that we would need to be concerned about, and perhaps even concurrently concerned about as a health community as to how we respond to that. They went on to say that education is going to be really important, screening and connecting people with treatment. And I'm wondering what you all could help our viewers understand about some of these common mental health concerns. What should folks be looking out for?
Let me offer an observation. I think we are living through what anthropologists might call a liminal period. A liminal period is a fuzzy boundary between what was and what is yet to be. And we are neither there nor there yet. It's a fluid time, an uncertain time, undefinite and undefined. We are beginning to get accustomed to it, as David indicated. We are kind of settling in a little bit, but there's still a great deal of unknowns. There's still a great deal of uncertainty. There is a sense of loss of control. So the average person, in addition, especially to the people who are first responders and frontline workers, physicians, nurses, health providers, feel not only worry, as Mohammed said, and not only fear, but in some cases, a sense of despair. And when despair begins to set in, that is when we have the possibility of mental illness, and that is when we need to pay attention. We all live throughout our lives with some level of worry, as you said. The question is, how do we navigate through it? And as a rabbi of a congregation, I am dealing with all types of people who need different and special attention. We have older adults with pre-existing health conditions, some physical, some mental. We have children and adolescents who are going through a certain developmental stage and who might be in home situations that where they had not spent that amount of time before. Particularly adolescents and college-aged young people are vulnerable at this time. School closings, homeschooling, postponed graduations, hopes and plans that have to be put on hold, economic plans impacted. And then there are women, mothers who care for children and sometimes who care for other older relatives at home. We also are observing, and our congregation has tried to be attentive to humanitarian concerns, both in our community and in the international scene. So one of the things that we have been attempting to do as a congregation is to bring ourselves out and to serve the community as best as we can under these circumstances. And that is a very helpful tool in dealing with one's own situation, if one is able to do so at whatever level. So I'll stop at those observations at this time.
I'd like to follow up on something that I think has not really been discussed that much overall during this pandemic. And that is what I really do perceive will be an evolving definition of what makes for a safe home. The little sound bites oftentimes are stay home, stay safe. Well, the recent figures is that in Seattle, the reports of domestic violence over the last few months went up 21%. The same time frame in North Carolina, it went up 17%. At the same time, there was a recent news article on NBC where they interviewed the director of the Center for Children and Women in Louisville, Kentucky. And she pointed out, and there's been other confirmation of this across the country, that at the same time, while you have increased numbers of report of domestic violence, the number of calls to abuse centers have gone down. So although there's no, a definitive connection between all this information, I think one has to wonder aloud and really assume that there are some people who have been sheltering who are quite unsafe. And so I'm hoping that one thing that can come of this pandemic is to really address the mental health issues, not only of individuals, I'm all for that, but what happens when people get together as families. It is indeed a myth that all families are safe places to be. So that's part of my big concern, and it's certainly something that I'm trying to gradually work with our students in the MFT program, since our area of expertise is families. So.
And I certainly want to support just what Suzanne said. I think there are challenges with so much togetherness, and that as our time together continues, frustrations are natural to begin to occur. Some other things that I've seen in some of my clients are difficulty with maintaining focus and concentration, kind of a growing sense of lethargy or lack of motivation. I think many of us, when we went home, had maybe put some plans in place for how we might use this time of rest. And that would be exercise and good nutrition and better sleep, doing things that are actually ideal if we can do them. But what I'm seeing is that people are beginning to struggle with that, and that some of their just personal self-care and personal hygiene is beginning to wane a bit. And so I think another dynamic of that, just trying to cope involves more alcohol use. People might be drinking more or using other kinds of substances. So I think there are some telltale ways in which people can begin to check themselves as to whether or not they're noticing some slippage in terms of their motivation or brain fog or even their ability to concentrate. That might be early signs of the beginning of an onset of being depressed. We're not made to live in this chronic state of anxiety, and that over a long period of time, it begins to take a toll on us.
I think a little bit to that conversation that both Rabbi Dennis and David and Suzanne have talked about, and talk to the context in my professional experience as a professor with students and what we've encountered and what we've seen there as we moved, if you will, in a weekend from a face-to-face environment to a virtual environment for learning. And what did that mean for the students when we converged into our homes for learning experiences where the challenge to balance home, work, family, and homeschooling kind of converged all at one time and in one place. And what did we see? We saw students being overwhelmed and distressed by having to social distance from loved ones, by having to quarantine, as we talked about, families in one space, in one place. It's not always a good scenario. And so the students and we talked about how they were experiencing elements of acute stress. And so that acute stress came about because of additional responsibilities for homeschooling, for having to do work at home, added work pressures where the work day seemed not to end, meaning we started at 8 o'clock in the morning, and because of everything that we were doing, that work day lasted until 8 or 9 at night. And so those are challenges. And then when we look at individuals who are on the front line providing care for individuals that are affected by the virus, their stress levels rise as well. And so we may see evidence of stress and evidence of increased anxiety, where there are somatic responses to faster heartbeats, to increased breathing, to feelings of being overwhelmed, irritability, being out of control, having to be at one place for a long period of time and not knowing when there will be relief causes other stress. And one of the symptoms that I see and have had talked about often are challenges with sleep patterns. So a lot of insomnia. But one of the things that I think we should highlight that will be very important that we're seeing now and that we will see post-pandemic is an increase and an uptick in post-traumatic stress. And I see that being evident not only with the first responders, but with individuals that have been infected by the virus. And as they deal with their own mortality, as they deal with questions of whether or not there will be a vaccine for this virus I've acquired, can I acquire this virus again? And so what happens? What type of care will we have in place for individuals who are having to make ethical and moral judgment about who lives and who gets treatment and who survives? And so being aware of those concerns for the people who are on the front lines, for survivors of this pandemic, are very important issues and concerns to be prepared for as clinicians and even as faith communities.
Important issues that have been raised from the context of the congregational experience. As a congregational rabbi, as a minister, pastor, I have tried during these extraordinary times to respond not with extraordinary measures, but with very ordinary measures. I think that one of the important things about situations like this is to redouble on the very proven ordinary measures that make a difference in the life of people. So under guidelines of social distancing, we have tried to maintain a sense of continuity, of community, of engagement. We have kept doing what congregations do regularly: educate, inspire, and console, and celebrate. We have counseled the distraught, we have comforted mourners, and we have buried our dead. Very difficult to deal with a grieving family from a social distance perspective, and to have a funeral where you have to tell the family that they have to select up to no more than 10 people to be at the graveside for the performance of the interment and mourning rituals. But people have been malleable and people have been inventive. And I am now seeing Zoom visitations to homes of mourning. People want to bring the ordinary into the extraordinary moment. So we have had to pivot, but our effort has been to maintain that regularity and continuity that people have identified with congregational life as best as possible. We've had to entirely change our life cycle calendar of boys and girls who are anticipating becoming bar and bat mitzvahs. That entails family dynamics. How are we going to do that? What about the guests? Can they come? So the extraordinary circumstances have required extraordinary adjustments, certainly medically and economically. But I think that the role of a congregation is to try to provide a little bit of the structure and guidance and resilience that will help people navigate through these uncertain times. And it's not always easy.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. I think that there is something about keeping as much routine, as much kind of ritual familiarity as possible in these anything but familiar and routine days. I wanted to make sure that I lifted up a question from the audience. And it asked about, we're talking about kind of what to look for and some common struggles during these times. They asked, how can we identify stress, anxiety, and depression for those who cannot speak for themselves? And so they're thinking specifically about young children, older adults. I'm also curious, I know that you, Mohammed, work with adolescents, so it may be that they can speak, but they may use other means as well to kind of show distress that may not be what some adults may use. And so I'm wondering if you could weigh in on kind of how some of those areas of the lifespan might be impacted.
Yes. So things I always look for are shifts in demeanor or shifts in your regular routine. It may not be a big transition. It may not be a big depressive episode. Hopefully it's not a big depressive episode. Sometimes it is. Maybe they're staying up a little later. Maybe they're sleeping a little longer. Maybe they're not as engaged as they were before. And that's hard to to call right now because of our different version of engagement right now. So it'll be hard for us to say, for example, if you have a child who goes to school every day, well, 5 days out of the week, a teacher could pick up and say, oh, hey, I noticed that your son he seems a little different in the classroom, but that's different now because the classroom has changed. So I will look for those who may not use the same language that we're always using. Look for changes in their demeanor. Look for changes in the way they interact with others. So that, as you mentioned, that will look different from different lifespan. From the 2-year-old who may say, "I want to sleep in your bed." All of a sudden, they were sleeping just fine in their own bed. Now all of a sudden they want to be clingy. To the teenager who may want to stay up all night and talk to their friends all day, because you think about it, probably haven't seen their peers in 2 or 3 months, like in a regular sense. So maybe someone who may be older, who maybe they're just, it's different light in them. It just looks different. So those are things I will look for, just the small changes, but do not ignore the big changes either.
Yeah, Mohammed, I would support that. I think that in our practice, what we see with a lot of teens is life has become like Groundhog Day, and every day is the same thing over and over. And as a result of that, they don't have as much to offer. And so the feedback that I'm getting is that a lot of them are beginning to even isolate from their own friends. Some of the online stuff that they might have done in the beginning, because they don't have much to offer, they've stopped even connecting with their friends. I think with small children, you're looking for agitation and frustration, or you're looking for some kind of comfort object that they hold on to and carry with them. And now they've got an attachment to that seems particularly strong, which might suggest a level of distress that they're carrying. And the same thing would be true for older adults. If you notice kind of a loss of life energy, kind of just a demeanor change where, that sense of light in their eyes seems diminished, those can be telltale signs that they're beginning to really struggle under our current situation. And whatever support you can offer to bring comfort is going to be useful to those who can't speak for themselves.
I think that term COVID fatigue, I think that's spot on. I just think it's just so relatable.
One thing I think too that oftentimes we, either as pastoral caregivers or mental health providers, end up doing is depending upon asking too many direct questions of people, assuming that we're going to get a direct answer. That's not been my experience in this field for over 25 years. And I do think certainly you look at behavioral things. I also want to offer something that I don't think we typically think of, and that is how people live their lives in stories. And sometimes you can engage, especially preschoolers, into a storytelling event. You can engage seniors into telling stories. You can think about what stories were these people sharing prior to the pandemic, and now how do they respond? There's some very good resources for this. We did a lot of this in my pastoral care class this semester. And if there's anyone in the audience who would be interested in some of those resources, if you can just email me at scoyle@cts.edu, I'd be glad to offer those resources.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add to the conversation, just oftentimes our children or little ones or even adolescents will mirror what they see happening in their parents and or caregivers. And so we, as those caregivers and parents, may not think that we're experiencing stress or experiencing depression or dealing with our loss or grief, but our children or those that we're raising or providing care for will demonstrate some of our own, if you will, emotions that are not being displayed or that we're not expressing. And maybe that is something too that we could be mindful of. How are we mirroring what we're experiencing and providing a safe space for our children to be able to do that as well?
You brought up something really important in the way of grief. And I wonder if we can spend some time there discussing what experiences people are grieving. We've got a question here from a viewer who says grief will be a large part of coming out of the pandemic. How can this be addressed? And this recognition that everyone's lost something, and what does the state of mind do to us? What can we do to respond to it?
I'll continue then a little bit in that conversation around grief. It is true, and that grief will be a part of this pandemic and post-pandemic and a part of our lives. As the viewer mentioned, everyone has lost something. And I think it's very critical and important to recognize that grief and losing something and someone is very much apparent for each individual, and we experience it differently. And what I want to encourage is that we allow ourselves to acknowledge that grief. We allow ourselves to be able to identify those losses that we've experienced. If it is loss of a loved one, if it is loss of resources, if it is loss of those employment opportunities or loss of shelter, whatever those losses are, being able to set space and place to acknowledge that, being okay, providing ourselves with the grace to be able to say, there are things in my life as a result of this pandemic, if you will, identify it as a natural disaster. And in a lot of ways, that's how I think of it. But being able to associate those losses, acknowledging those losses, giving yourself the space for that. And as we're giving ourselves the space for the loss, be okay with dealing with the various stages of what loss might look like. If it is denial, if it is acceptance, if it is anger, if it is trying to bargain around, understanding that. And then as Kubler-Ross talked about those 5 stages, know that there's other stages as well of finding some meaning as a result of that loss, and understanding that those losses are critical. And as a result of that, what does it mean? Where do I go and how do I go forward? Recognizing that and walking with that and holding space for that. That's going to be important, particularly as we deal with loss of loved ones to this pandemic and not being able to have that closure that we would normally have as we celebrate their lives in rituals of in rituals of funerals and repasses and home celebrations where we all gather together in one space. So that's going to be very important to acknowledge it, hold space for it, and allow ourselves to grieve in the manner in which we need to.
I think there are some new kinds of approaches in looking at grief over the last 10, 20 years in terms of not trying to, quote unquote, work through a loss as if one ever really works through a loss. There's always kind of an emptiness that people experience. I mean, it varies with time. But a professor who teaches in the California State University system, Lorraine Hetke, has done quite a bit of work around this notion of grief. And it's a new concept called remembering. She's won some awards from the American Psychological Association. And it's really about looking at our lives in the present and how did that person we lost, how did that dream we lost, how would it speak to us in our current life? So we really look up at the effects, and then also what kind of message and what kind of impact did that loss of a dream or that loss of a person have for us as we move forward. So it's a little bit different way of looking at grief, and this is certainly a very unique situation we're in, and one that none of us are expert at.
Could I jump in here? Grief will be experienced at many levels. I mean, young people, about whom we were talking a few moments ago, will experience a certain sense of loss of their adolescence and their social connectedness at this time, which is a very important way of experiencing who they are and becoming who they are yet to be. And that will be something that parents and communities and congregations and support systems will have to be attentive to as we emerge from this isolation. This summer, for example, young people have completed their homeschooling, at least through their formal education. And many of them will not be able to go to camp as they had anticipated. So there's going to be a sense of loss and disconnectedness depending on how long the social distances continues. The flip side of that is if we begin to reconnect socially, to create a sense of structure and propriety, especially for young adults as they go out in the community and begin to reconnect, because there's going to be a certain exuberance there, naturally so, that may need to have some attention. I have had weddings postponed, bar and bat mitzvahs, and we have rescheduled confirmation services. In the Jewish tradition, we feel that we try to do our grief in the moment. So we have maintained the practice of burying our dead and having as a funeral service soon after the death of a loved one, and encouraging the families to connect with others through social media so that they can receive that support from the community. That type of grief postponed, I think, and unritualized, I think is the most difficult to overcome in the long term. So even in the context of the loss of a loved one and the difficult circumstances, I would encourage people to do the necessary ritual procedure that will allow you at least some form of closure of the loss of the loved one, especially if you had not been able to be with that loved one towards the last weeks, towards the last months, because he or she may have been in a nursing home or other forms of disconnection. So each type of grief requires a different response. And we were talking before about households and the new tensions and realities of living in a household. We don't know what things might look like for families 3, 9, a year from now, months or a year from now.
Yeah, grief certainly is a vulnerable time. And I want to pick up something that's in the question, which is this is going to be a shared grief. Everybody is going to have a story of grief. And it actually provides an opportunity for us to show compassion and empathy and kindness. And our shared grief can actually become potentially a time of connecting at a much deeper level. So while I believe and agree that it is true that all of us will have lost something, being mindful of how we tend to each other and how we care for each other and how we keep our heart open to each other can some ways help encourage a greater healing, I think, as we all can come together and show compassion and kindness to one another.
The class I taught this semester was entitled Basics of Pastoral Care and Counseling. And for several weeks after the pandemic closed us down at CTS, we had lengthy check-ins with students about their concerns and so forth. This went on for several weeks, and then it struck me that perhaps there could be another way that they as a community could deal with their loss in a constructive manner. And so we had a conversation, and the entire class did a project on COVID-19. And they focused upon just the research around COVID-19, educating themselves. Some of them were doing CPE, were chaplains in a hospital. Some of them were working in grocery stores. Many of them had firsthand accounts of being close, physically distant-wise, with people who were COVID-19 patients. And so they did a whole project. They looked at, too, what are some unique ways that this is impacting us in terms of how we respond to this, how we share our anger in productive kinds of ways. And it was a really good experience. And I think a way for the class communally to grieve about some of their losses. We still had check-ins, but they were able to do some of their personal grieving as they were trying to reach out to other people. And they did a beautiful presentation. They are available for congregations who might have a minister listening at this moment. Just let me know. But it was a unique experience, as David was talking about this need to grieve communally. So I hope that we'll be able to find some ways to do that as different communities.
That's where the congregational experience becomes so important. A story is told of the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was asked what was the first evidence of civilization that she would attest to. And she pointed to a human thigh bone with a healed fracture that had been discovered in an ancient grave in an archaeological site 15,000 years ago. So she was asking, how come this? How come not tools for hunting or religious artifacts that point to human advancement technically? And Margaret Mead said that in order for a person to survive a broken femur, that individual had to have been cared for long enough by others for the bone to heal. Others must have provided the shelter, the protection, the food, and the drink to allow that person to heal. That, she said, was the first evidence of human civilization. And that's a challenge.
I think this is a wonderful opportunity to kind of turn our attention to how does this look to be community, to support and to respond faithfully to the needs of members around mental health. And so I wonder what suggestions you would have for faith communities around what they could do, how kind of creative responses could be delivered in this climate.
Well, I think a few options are out there. I'm thinking of right now, Muslims are going through Ramadan, and we have our a morning meal, if you will, suhoor, and then we also have an iftar where we break our fast. And there was a wonderful story this morning on I think it was CBS this morning that had they follow like 4 or 5 Muslim families and said, well, how are you going through this pandemic? And they really showed, highlighted how there are groups of people or Muslims who are having iftar together online. So I ran across one of my peers had mentioned how helpful having online services have been for them, and I'm talking about Sunday services have been so helpful for them, so they can find their home away from home. Keep in mind, I'm in a very transient town in Bloomington, so maybe their home is Mississippi. So maybe they're going through this pandemic and they're feeling like they're on their own. But if you can, what I encourage all services to do, if they haven't done already, is to stream and continue to stream, because you don't know who's watching. And there may be someone who has been a part of your congregation when they were 7, but they had to leave for whatever reason, or maybe they haven't been there for a few months because they can't get there. So I highly suggest, if you haven't been streaming, begin to stream. It has a really large impact on your community, our community.
Suzanne had mentioned earlier that the importance of story. And so I think congregations that can gather people once we're able to be together and provide opportunity for people to tell their stories, whether that's in a small group environment or whether it's a congregational meal, but it provides opportunity for people to share their story and kind of what it has been like for them. And I also think congregations and faith communities can do a good job of connecting people to our religious or theological stories. There are certainly stories of people in times when we wandered through the wilderness and we lived day by day and we didn't know what was coming next. And, you know, during that period of time, we worked on our values, we worked on our principles, we worked on who we wanted to be when we came into a new land. And I see us as kind of moving through that same kind of process right now. We're living in this time of uncertainty. We're trying to figure out who we are in the midst of this quarantine, and what do we hope life will be like, and what do we want life to be like as we move into a new day. So I think any way in which congregations can connect us to our stories, our faith stories, and provide opportunity for us to tell our stories, I think that will help us in the grieving process and help us to be able to move forward as we begin to heal.
I have a firm hope that I don't know will be realized or not, but my hope is that congregations can be courageous enough to take this moment in our history to do some really radical things that they would not be doing otherwise. I keep hearing the phrase, the new normal, and I've always been a person who believes strongly that normality is vastly overrated. So I would hope that we look at ways in our history. Normality has brought on racism, sexism, ageism, heteronormativity. I could go on and on, but I will subside my comments at that. But I think what it should be about, hopefully, is that we can really look at our ethic of faith that is love and compassion. And how does that speak to us when we realize now in the pandemic that our society is so fractured? What do we do with that? I hope and pray congregations do not go back and believe that what has been is what needs to be.
Yeah, I would affirm that, and perhaps remind us that the good old normal wasn't so good when it wasn't so old, right? There is a question that picks up on David's earlier comment. Panelist, somebody's asking about the balance between faith and science in the context of this pandemic. I have always told my congregation that we trust that from science and from medicine will come the cure for this pandemic. Faith will provide us with the wherewithal to navigate the time until we get there. I like to distinguish between hope and faith. Hope is the affirmation that things will get better. But faith is the affirmation that even if they don't, or not yet, we can still get through it and hopefully to the other side. People often quote the 23rd Psalm primarily at funerals, and it is unfortunate because it is not a funereal psalm. The 23rd Psalm has a line that is translated, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Well, that is the King James mistake. The Hebrew does not mean there the valley of the shadow of death. It means a valley of deep darkness. Yea, though I walk through a time of deep darkness, I will not fear. So we are walking through that valley of deep darkness. And what will help us get across until science provides us with the cure is the faith to endure walking through the valley. Not a Pollyannish faith, but a mature, responsible, cohesive, collective, as well as individual faithfulness, which is really the meaning of the word faith. Faithfulness, fidelity, trustworthiness.
We have the saying, tie your camel. Make sure you have faith. That's wonderful, but tie your camel, meaning listen to the scientific. We have rules and regulations out here for a reason. So make sure you're following those as well. So you can have the balance. I jokingly said this before. I said you could be on your Dean and on your medication. Dean is kind of your walking life with faith. I said that in context of someone had asked about medication and stigma within faith, or folks who may be walking in faith. And that's the context of it. So what I'm saying is there is a balance, and there can be a balance.
Yeah, I'm not going to take on the coronavirus from a science standpoint, but from a brain science standpoint, what we're wanting to do is to create the healthiest brain we can. Because when we're under the chronic stress that we're under, the adrenaline and cortisol basically devours serotonin and other brain transmitters that are essential for an optimistic and positive mood, and which is why we begin to see this gradual decline in the way we're thinking and our ability to function. So the brain science would suggest, and mental health would suggest, a two-prong approach. One is just maintaining physical health. What are we doing through nutrition, through supplements, through sleep, through exercise to keep our brain as healthy as we can? And then the second part of it is, what are our beliefs? And what beliefs are getting in our way of living from a place of hope, living from a place of optimism, living from a strong place of faith. And those are secondary issues that we can deal with. Right now we can address some of those personal hygiene and self-care elements in order to create the best possible healthy environment for ourselves. And that's the science that we can deal with, as we also try to work and live out the way we've been taught through our faith, which leads to healthy function.
Yes, this has been such a fruitful and wonderful generative conversation. And I would like for us to really hone in on this vision of what will be the new normal, as we, yes, very much so understand that we will not be going backward to some kind of, in the past version of back to normal. And so I am curious about what we're learning as communities, as individuals, as communities of faith during the pandemic is perhaps even going to expand or widen our understanding of mental health care, and how it may be that we take this even into the future in ways that are really needful and really really helpful. I wonder how we could be changed for the better. I wonder if there's ways that you all would hope that would be the case. And we can go by each person, and if you would say a little bit about that. And also if you would if there's any kind of practical resource that you would like to give to the audience, I would ask that you mention that as well. But how might this be something that changes us for the better? And what are some practical resources that you want to leave the audience with? Nicole, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you. I think that one of the things as faith communities and even as the community at large, as we're thinking about meeting spiritual needs and physical needs such as food and financial resources and providing connection, I would encourage us not to neglect an individual's psychological needs. Mental health issues and concerns are real. And so how can then we as a faith community partner with mental health professionals in order to provide our communities with the resources that they might need in order to be able to, one, if you will, identify what's acute stress? What are some symptoms, as we had questions around understanding depression or anxiety? What might that look like? How could we have resources available to our faith communities that identify information related to various issues around mental health and what that might look like? How can we partner with them in order to provide churches or faith communities with the gift of referral so that individuals can have at hand resources such as ourselves or other resources such as our counseling center at CTS to be able to provide its members or its congregation or its community members at large with safe and sound psychological assistance and help that we might need? And how could we partner together to ensure that when someone is in crisis, that we share that same pain and that same hurt, and that we want to make sure that they get the help that they would need as well. So I would advocate partnering with local faith communities as a mental health clinician and professional psychological healthcare provider to be able to provide those resources and that information and referral opportunities. And so I think that would be critical and crucial to this time. One resource, because I'm new to the area, but one resource that I would recommend outside of our counseling center at CTS would be a national resource called NAMI. There's actually a syndicate of it here in Indiana, where people can find resources that explain various mental health conditions, provide resources for support for family members, help me to understand if I am the person dealing with a mental health concern, what some treatment options for me, crisis hotlines, because as we know with this pandemic and individuals dealing with the frontline treatment of individuals with COVID, we are seeing a spike in suicidal ideation and even completions of suicide. So we want to make sure that when individuals are in crisis, they have someone that they can talk to. So thank you for that time.
Thank you, Nicole. Suzanne?
Yes, one thing I think that is a good resource, it goes with my whole belief that understanding our own stories is the way to both communal and individual health. And I think that if we want to go backward, that's not it. But how are we able to move forward? How would we like our future story to be? What are our hopes and dreams? I think that's the essence of faith. So this is an opportunity for us to realize that. And I think in terms of resources, I would offer forth any of my students with the great work they did on COVID-19. I think congregations certainly are able to call upon people from outside their congregations as we re-enter a world of being more connected in person, and actually ask for some support and some assistance. It's really hard to do all of that yourself. And if you're the rabbi, if you're the pastor, if you're the priest, if you're the imam, whoever you may be, you have some of your own grieving to do. So I would strongly suggest that people reach out to other people in the community, and hopefully we'll be able to support all of us as congregations, as mosques, as whatever we have. That would be my hope and dream.
I'd like to end with a suggestion, a piece of advice, and then read a very brief poem. If I would have one suggestion to make, is that even as we have talked about the young and the old in separate categories, that this is a time when, if you are a youth, you should be communicating with an older person. And if you are an elder, you should be talking to younger people. The exchange will not only help us gain some perspective and history, but also a sense of hope and a sense of promise. Even though we think of religion as what the older generation teaches the younger generation, there is a fascinating statement in the Talmud, collection of Jewish wisdom and teaching, that says, "Happy the generation where the old learn from the young." And this is the dialogue that I would like us to see emerging from here. And then my son is a psychiatrist, my daughter is a psychologist, my daughter-in-law is a psychiatrist, my other son-in-law is a chiropractor. So he's the only one that can set you straight. But my son, the psychiatrist, sent me this poem by Wendell Berry, which he published in a message of his. "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to the real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings." So perhaps this period will help us to deal with the unexpected in future times.
One of the lessons that I think the coronavirus has revealed to us is how interconnected we all really are. What I've experienced through this is the profound importance of belonging. So one of the ways I've been having fun with some of my clients is helping them think about their quarantine, TEAM. Who's on their team? Who is a person that they can identify? Can they create a special kind of connection or relationship under the umbrella of team? Maybe it's a larger group, maybe it's a family. But how can they have fun with that? Because that sense of interconnectedness and that sense of belonging, I think, is what will eventually heal us from these times of isolation that we've experienced and some of the experiences that we've had. So I would encourage people to think about who is on their quarantine, or who would they like to invite into their quarantine. And some of my clients have had fun with naming their team and coming up with logos and just looking for fun ways to be connected in a unique and special way, which I think helps them enjoy a little bit and have a little bit more closeness and belonging and recognizing that interconnectedness as we continue on these challenging days. I'd also invite people to contact Centerpoint Counseling. We've got 12 therapists on staff, and because of telehealth, we're able to respond to you no matter, in some cases, what your location might be. And would offer that as a resource so that we can help you find the right person and be connected to a therapist in your area.
Thank you, David. Mohammed?
Yes, one thing I would like to kind of close on, I think it's been echoed already, but we have to keep in mind, none of this is the normal right now. I mean, none of this is normal. Meaning none of this is what we've seen before. And our kids and our grandkids are going to ask us about this. I tell my clients often, it's like they're going to talk about this 50 years from now. And they may ask you, what were you doing during this time? So keep in mind that we're still pushing through something that's really unique. Some resources that I would like to highlight are some resources many of the listeners may already have that they don't realize they have at their fingertips. For those who are, your insurance may cover a whole lot of your services. That's one thing. Another thing is maybe where you're working, they may have something that has some type of employment assistance program that will pay for services as well. So sometimes we may think, well, I don't need the services or I don't want to pay for the services, which is, I think that's fair to say. But I don't want us to overlook some of the resources that we have right at our fingertips. I think what was mentioned earlier, I think Nicole, you had mentioned about the connectedness between community and the community of mental health, and I really think that's important. But I would like for it to be ongoing, not a drop in once. And hi, my name is Muhammad. I do counseling, blah blah blah. Like, no, we need to be in there consistently. And that's what I don't have to deliver a sermon, but I would like to be a part of a community, be part of being recognizable. So when there is a need for a referral, it's that much smoother. It's that much more relatable and trustworthy. And I think that's what we're all aiming towards. I think also on psychologytoday.com, there's a resource that people can use to find different therapists, psychiatrists in their areas. I really like that site, not only because I'm on it, but I like the site because it has bios and different depictions of different providers in different areas. You can filter through state, through insurance types. So those are some resources I would like to just highlight to our listeners. And by the way, I didn't notice we were trending on social media as we're speaking. I took a glance and said, "Whoa, what they're talking about us." No pressure.
Well, that is wonderful news because this has been so helpful. And I just want to express my sincere gratitude for you sharing all of your expertise, your wisdom, for the information. I think that this will really help folks navigate this very unique and unprecedented time together. And so I want to say thank you for all of our viewers also that have tuned in. Know that on behalf of CTS that we are prayerful, we are hopeful that everybody is doing well. And as has been echoed, that it's important to know that we're not alone, right? To not only reach out, but accept when someone reaches out to you, right? That to accept the help, but also to help others. And I'm very encouraged by doing just that. So be well, everyone. Until we gather again, take good care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.